At the basis, though, most states' food health regulations or food safety regulations are based on what's called the Food Code, which is issued by the FDA every 4 years. They update it. It's a document that sets out the best manufacturing practices based on current scientific understanding of the best ways to reduce the chance of foodborne illness or other kind of food safety problems. And so the FDA issues the Food Code every 4 years. It used to be every 2, but now they update it every 4. And it's essentially a resource for states or municipalities to use in adopting their own food safety regulations. And some states adopt the Food Code wholesale, just take literally the entire document and just put North Carolina, for instance, on the front of it. And this is North Carolina's Food Code, but it is verbatim the FDA's Food Code. Some states will take the principles in the FDA Food Code and modify or adopt them kind of maybe piecemeal, or provide their own amendments or state-specific items that they want included in the Food Code. We're also going to be discussing California today, and California is a great example of this. I think the current basis of their health regulations is the 2005 FDA Food Code, but they have adopted them into their own code system with their own special requirements, their own amendments, and state-specific terminology and processes. The Food Code is not mandatory, so like I said, it really is just a resource. So as you can see, the earliest or the kind of oldest Food Code operating at the time of this chart, which was actually August 2013. So this might have changed in the past 2 years. But at this time, at the time of August 2013, the oldest Food Code in operation was the 1993 Food Code. To give you an example, before that, I think North Carolina was previously the oldest operating Food Code. In 2012, North Carolina switched to the 2009 Food Code, but before that they were still operating under the 1976 Food Code. And so you will sometimes see a very wide swing, although currently we're just looking at the 1983 to 2009. Although 2012 has been issued, I do not know of any states that have adopted 2012 yet, but it is, or sorry, 2013. I don't know of any states that have adopted 2013 yet, but it is available if you would like to read it. It's also a great way to just kind of get an idea of the breadth of regulations that are out there and the specificity which the Food Code typically demands. All right, so getting into these issues so you can make your client aware of the type of items that they're going to experience during their inspection. And this might be, well, hopefully they have food service experience, and so this won't be anything new to them. But a lot of times it will be, depending on your client. And so it's very important to go through these items with them. Even though you're not a food safety expert, this is a very good way to kind of get a feel for if their business plan, the timing of when they're going to be at different stops, how much time they're budgeting to spend in the commissary. It's important to go through these with them to see if their business plan and their operating procedures accommodate enough time and space to go through all of the processes that the Food Code requires. So an example of the variety of regulations that the Food Code will impose, there are rules regarding the food sources. Where does the food truck or restaurant, where does the eating establishment get its ingredients? If the person who sold the food, were they complying with the applicable law? Depending on the product, it might have to be a certified seller. For example, if you're obtaining meat from a vendor, it obviously has to be certified by the USDA and inspected by the USDA at a processing facility. Also, this is something that is not very well known, but for example, if you're getting wild mushrooms, the wild mushrooms have to be sold to the restaurant or at least approved by a mushroom identification expert. I did not know that job existed until recently, and it sounds pretty awesome. But yes, your wild mushrooms are going to have to be identified by someone who knows what they are, so they can certify that they're not poisonous and they are in fact chanterelles or whatever they're labeled as. So the FDA Food Code is also going to regulate the type of foods that you can receive from a vendor. There's a very big trend currently towards raw juices. Raw juices actually cannot be wholesaled in the United States, and so if you're a restaurant, you cannot purchase raw juice from a vendor. There are many vendors out there who will attempt to sell your food truck raw juice, but that is something that cannot be wholesaled. If juice is going to be wholesaled and sold from vendor to vendor, it does have to be pasteurized or some kind of pathogen reduction treatment, such as pasteurization, in order to reduce the pathogens, potential pathogens in that juice. Additionally, there are some milk and egg products which the FDA Food Code will require to be pasteurized as well. So the Food Code is going to regulate the type of foods that they can receive. I think a lot of times with the inventiveness of a lot of food trucks, maybe they have a special recipe or a quirky ingredient and they think that they can get it from anywhere, and that's not exactly true. So depending on that ingredient, it might have to go through another step of authorization. The Food Code is going to regulate if the incoming ingredients are labeled properly. One example of this, if you're buying shellfish that has already been shucked, that when you receive it, it must be labeled with the packer information as well as the best by date or the date of shucking. So these rules, as I said, they're going to be very specific, and your client will need to read and become familiar with the entire food code. It's definitely, obviously, one food truck isn't going to be serving the whole spectrum of ingredients out there, and so fortunately, when you are working with a food code, working with a food truck client, you can find out what their menu is, and they can look at the applicable regulations that are going to govern the meats, ingredients, and processes that they're using. The food sources, any food received also has to be received at the proper temperature. If it's potentially hazardous food and kept cold, it has to be kept under 41 degrees. If it is a cooked food that was potentially hazardous, it has to be received at 135 degrees. If it's kept hot. Frozen foods obviously still have to be frozen upon receipt. They can't be partially thawed. You have to examine the food to see if it's experienced if you can see any signs of temperature abuse, and any foods that do show signs of temperature abuse should be rejected and not received by the food truck. The next kind of step in the food production process that the FDA Food Code governs are steps for preventing contamination. Once you have received that food, how do you make sure that you continue to prevent contamination, either from allowing bacteria or pathogens to proliferate or cross-contamination? How do you keep the different ingredients from contaminating each other? So obviously this is going to involve a regimen of very strict hand washing requirements. If there is ready-to-eat food, it should be handled with gloves. You should avoid bare hand contact. So gloves, or if you could do all of your food moving with a spatula or tongs, some kind of food utensil that is not your bare hand. You're going to want to separate and store raw foods in different areas and in different containers in order to prevent cross-contamination. When you're working with food prep, it's best to use a particular cutting board for one ingredient and do all of that prep at once, clean the cutting board or the prep area, and move on to the next ingredient. But it's typically a very bad idea to be using the same cutting board for different types of prep going on at the same time. You do want to do one ingredient all at once and then move on. So then you'll see storage requirements. Once you've prepped, cooked, or handled the food, you want to make sure you're labeling it. When was it received? When was it cut? The FDA Food Code is going to govern where you may store these foods, and this sounds like a silly question. There's only a limited number of places you can store it, but the FDA Food Code is going to regulate the proximity of the food storage to the sinks where there might be splatter. Are there enough splash guards? They're also going to regulate the proximity to the floor to keep all of those ingredients up off of that danger zone on the floor. The FDA Food Code is also going to provide particular equipment requirements. Is the equipment that you're working with certified by independent organizations such as UL, NSF, or the ANSI? Are you using the proper equipment for the process that you're attempting to use on the food? Are you cleaning the equipment properly? Are you using the correct type of gloves or linens? So there is almost no detail too small for the FDA Food Code. And if you have one of those clients who has not worked in food service before, it's going to seem like an overwhelming amount of regulation, but these really are, this is an area where you want an overwhelming amount of regulation. They very clearly set out what is expected of kitchens, and it's for, obviously, for public health. But it is amazing how quickly things can go wrong in the kitchen. And when I said earlier that health departments are wary of people who have not worked in the food industry before, that's one of the things that they're looking for, is an appreciation by the person running the kitchen of how quickly things can go wrong. The slightest temperature difference can cause a food to go out that has harmful organisms and can cause a lot of sick people. And so that's what they're looking for, an appreciation of the potential outcome of what's happening when you're preparing food for public consumption. All right. So the FDA Food Code, the recent versions, this first requirement on this list is Food Protection Manager Certification. And the most recent versions of the FDA Food Code do require someone in the kitchen who is managing it at all times have an accredited certification from a group or training organization that the FDA or your state health department has approved to train the manager on basically the FDA Food Code, food safety, food handling, and also to train them to, that it's a manager certification. So they're going to have to be the point person in the kitchen answering all of the questions that might come up from other, lower ranked employees on what best practices are and what the procedure is for this or that. So someone in the kitchen at all times is going to have that certification. So if you have a day manager and a night manager, both of them need to be trained with that certification. The most important kind of chunk of the FDA Food Code are the time and temperature requirements. So these are, again, very specific. They set out, depending on the type of food and the type of process, either thawing, cooling, heating, cooking, freezing, the type of process and the type of food, what the temperatures need to be and for how long the food needs to be held or taken to that temperature in order to adequately destroy and eliminate all of the organisms that are of a public health concern. So, as I mentioned, these temperatures will be different depending on the type of meat that's being cooked. There are specific requirements for how long, if you're freezing fish to destroy pathogens. Actually, well, obviously freezing does not destroy bacteria, but in the case of fish, if it's going to be served raw, you can freeze the fish in order to destroy parasites. Although the bacteria will not be affected, this is an effective way to eliminate parasites. So there'll be requirements for how long you have to cook meat or fish, or if it's served raw, how long it has to be frozen in order to eliminate those parasites. If you're going to have, some places have either a service buffet or in the kitchen if things are going to be kept at a hot or cold temperature that are ready to eat for food service. If it's going to be kept cold, it has to be 41 or below, and if it's going to be kept hot, it has to be kept at 135 or above. And then another item that the FDA Food Code regulates that is commonly done improperly in people's homes is if you are thawing or cooling. Anytime you're bringing ingredients kind of up or down in temperature, it should be accomplished within a certain period of time. For example, when you're cooling food that you've just cooked to the proper temperature, when you're bringing it down to then store it cold, when it's between 41 and 135, that's the danger zone for the growth and proliferation of unsafe organisms. And so there's a certain time period by which you need to bring the food from one state, cold or hot, to the other. Also with thawing, when you're bringing foods up from the freezer, from frozen, you'll often find if you just leave it out on the counter, that actually creates a very unsafe condition in which the exterior of the meat or whatever the ingredient is reaches 41 degrees while the interior is still frozen. And so the FDA Food Code regulates how you thaw materials in order to prevent this situation. It's safest to thaw things in the refrigerator, but you can also do it, under room temperature or cold running water, and that will keep, the exterior or make the thawing a more even process. Finally, with time temperature controls, this is date marking goes under storage actually, but all right. Another item that the FDA Food Code is going to regulate, and this is something that is found in the more recent versions of the FDA Food Code. So if you're one of those states working off 1993, this might not be a requirement there. And this is something that even if states are operating under a more current food code, if they haven't adopted it wholesale, this might be something that they exclude from adopting, because it does, when a state makes a transition to requiring these specialized processing methods undergo HACCP plans and variances, that can create a particularly burdensome but very important process. So what we're looking at here, specialized processing methods, these are semi-commonplace processing methods, and I think they're becoming more popular. Especially in the food truck scene, a lot of the menus are, they're kind of staking their claim on inventive ingredients and really unique preparations. And so with these specialized processing methods, they're called specialized because the way that they are done involves a different procedure from what's generally accepted in the FDA Food Code. Either the timing is too long or too short, or the temperatures are not under 41 or over 135, or even higher for the times in which, the temperatures at which meat must be cooked. So these are called specialized because they differ from what is generally accepted. For instance, if you're smoking meat to preserve it, if you are curing meat for preservation, if you have acidified and canned foods, reduced oxygen packaging, shellfish tanks for sustaining the shellfish until you're ready to kill and prepare that fish, and sometimes with sprouting seeds or beans. These can take place at the wrong temperature, and so if you engage in any of these processing methods, or if your client engages in any of these processing methods, they're going to have to create what's called a HACCP plan. And HACCP is an abbreviation for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Point Plan. So this is essentially a system or a process by which your client will identify the risks inherent in using any of these processing methods, and identifying the critical control points, which are the points during the processing method when a particular temperature has to be reached, or a certain test has to show that something has been eliminated. Or you could tell by the texture, or there has to be a checkpoint at which you have to be able to determine if it has worked properly, essentially. So a question I get here commonly and you will too, if your food truck has a process that requires a HACCP plan, is this something that you can help them with? And this is something that I always pass off. It is a very detailed process that is more scientific than my legal training has equipped me for. And so there are typically a lot of resources in many areas for people who do need help with HACCP plans. There are online instructions as well as templates that can be used. In North Carolina, I'm very close to NC State University, and they have a really wonderful food science program. That food science program often teaches classes on drafting HACCP plans. Your local restaurant association might offer classes on drafting HACCP plans, and so this is something that you should obviously be aware of the need for a HACCP plan and the principles behind one, but that is something that there are other resources available for teaching your client how to draft a HACCP plan. And also how to follow one. Part of a HACCP plan is typically record keeping to ensure that each batch is made properly. So to how to draft a HACCP plan and follow it, how to train your employees to do everything properly. So yes, if you're using one of these specialized processing methods, you'll need a HACCP plan and a variance, which is approval from your health department, which basically says that they have reviewed your HACCP plan and they've reviewed your process, and they are granting you the ability to continue using that processing method, even though it deviates from what is otherwise required by the food code. One thing I do want to note, these specialized processing methods refer to any time you use these methods. I'm speaking now specifically about smoking or acidified foods. They are only considered specialized when you use those methods for preservation and not just flavor enhancement. So, pickles are very, at least in the South, pickles are a very, hot menu item. And if you're pickling foods to preserve it, to keep that food longer and at a different temperature than you would normally, then you need a specialized process. You need a HACCP plan. If you're pickling that food for flavor, just to get that really bright, vinegary, tart punch, and you're not keeping the food longer than you would otherwise, that's something that does not require a HACCP plan. And the same thing for smoking. If you're smoking that meat to preserve it and keep it longer than you would normally and at a different temperature than you would normally, that requires a HACCP plan. If you're just smoking something to add that smoky flavor to it, does not require one.